Most people assume they know where the line is, that invisible boundary between interfering in your adult child's life and doing what every bone in your body tells you is right. I used to think I knew where that line was, too. I was wrong. And it took a 9-year-old girl standing in my kitchen doorway in her pajamas, holding a stuffed rabbit named Biscuit, asking me if she was going to the airport tomorrow, to make me understand that some lines don't exist to be respected. Some lines exist to be crossed. Her name is Maya. She has been my granddaughter for 4 years, since my daughter Renee and her husband Patrick brought her home from foster care when Maya was 5. She has dark eyes that take everything in before she says a single word, and a laugh that starts quiet and then gets away from her, like she's always a little surprised by how good things can feel. She calls me Grandpa Lou. She has called me that since the 2nd month. I didn't ask her to. She just decided. The morning I walked into Renee's house and realized what had happened, I was carrying a bag of groceries and wearing the same green flannel shirt I've worn every Saturday for the better part of a decade. I am 67 years old, recently retired from 31 years as a civil engineer, and I have driven the same 2009 Ford F-150 since before my wife Margaret passed. People have been telling me to replace that truck since about 2015. I have not replaced that truck. I know what holds and what doesn't, and that truck holds. Margaret bought me the little pine tree air freshener that hangs from the rear view mirror on our last anniversary before she got sick. The scent ran out years ago, but the tree is still there. These are the things that matter to me. A lot of people don't understand that, and I've learned not to explain it. I was not supposed to be at Renee's house that Saturday. She had called me Thursday evening and said she was taking the kids to Italy for 10 days, a surprise for Caleb and Sophie's spring break, and could I water her plants while she was gone? I said of course. She said she'd leave a key under the mat, same as always. She sounded tired on the phone, which was not unusual. Renee has been tired in a particular way for about 2 years now. A tiredness that sits behind her eyes and doesn't go away with sleep. What she didn't tell me, and what I didn't know until I knocked on the back door and heard nothing, and let myself in, and stood in a kitchen that smelled of maple syrup and something faintly burnt, was that Maya was still there. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal going soft in milk, her rabbit propped against the sugar bowl, a library book open in front of her that she was not reading. She looked up at me the way she always did, taking me in first before she committed to a reaction. And then she said, quietly, like she was asking about the weather, "Grandpa Lou, did Mommy forget to tell you I was here?" I set the groceries on the counter. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. I looked at her face, and I thought about the 31 years I spent calculating load distribution on bridges, making sure the weight never landed where the structure couldn't hold it. And I thought, this child has been carrying something she shouldn't have to carry. And I thought, I almost didn't come until Monday. I need to back up, because none of this will make the right kind of sense without the context of who Renee is and who she has been, and more importantly, who she has been trying to become for the past several years. My daughter is 41 years old, and she is, in many respects, a genuinely good person. That is not a qualified compliment.
She is generous with her time and her money. She volunteers at her church. She remembers birthdays. And when my wife Margaret was in hospice in the last 3 weeks of her life, Renee slept on a cot in the hallway every single night. I know who my daughter is. I raised her for 18 years, and I have watched her carefully for 23 more. What I also know, and what became harder to ignore as the years went on, is that Renee has always had a particular talent for constructing the life that looks the way she wants it to look. Not out of vanity exactly, or at least not only vanity. More like a deep, almost architectural need for things to be in their proper place. Her house is beautiful. Her children are well-dressed. Her marriage to Patrick is, from the outside, serene. Everything has its place. Everything is clean. Everything is considered. Caleb is 14 and Sophie is 11, and they were born into this constructed life, and they fit inside it the way children fit when everything has been prepared for them in advance. They are good kids, both of them. Caleb plays lacrosse. Sophie is learning violin. They know where they stand in the world their parents have built. Maya came into that world from a different world entirely. Renee and Patrick had been on the adoption waiting list for nearly 3 years before Maya's caseworker called. And when Renee told me, she was crying with happiness, the kind of crying that doesn't leave room for words. I was there for the first meeting, sitting in a county social services waiting room with worn carpet and a fish tank with 2 fish in it, when this small, watchful child walked in, holding a paper bag with everything she owned, and looked around the room like she was memorizing it in case she needed to describe it later to someone. I loved her immediately.
Not in the way you love something cute or something helpless. In the way you recognize someone. She reminded me of my brother David, who we lost at 46 to a heart condition, who used to say that the best way to know a place was to be quiet in it. Maya was quiet in it, in the way of someone who had learned that speaking too soon cost you things you couldn't get back. The first year was hard. Renee had read every book, attended every seminar, hired a family therapist. She went in prepared, and she went in with her whole heart, and I believe, genuinely, that her intentions were as good as intentions can be. But intentions are blueprints. They're not the building. And somewhere in the second year, something began to shift in ways that were hard to name and easy to overlook. Small things, at first. The way dinner conversation would pivot naturally to Caleb's lacrosse game or Sophie's recital, and Maya would be quiet in a different way than her natural quiet. A positioned quiet, a careful quiet, like she was making herself smaller. The way Renee would say, "our family," and there was something almost too deliberate in the inclusiveness of it, like she was correcting something that needed correcting before anyone pointed it out. The way Patrick, who was kind to Maya, and who I don't believe is a cruel man, would interact with Caleb and Sophie with a specific kind of easy fluency. Inside jokes, references to old trips, a shorthand built over years that simply didn't exist yet with Maya, and perhaps didn't know how to exist, and no one was putting in the particular work it would have taken to build it. I noticed these things. I filed them. I told myself it was adjustment. I told myself these things took time. I told myself my daughter loved this child.
And then I almost didn't come until Monday. Maya finished her cereal while I sat across from her and tried to keep my face calm and steady, the way I'd learned to keep it in 30 years of project reviews when the numbers on the table were worse than anyone wanted to say out loud. She ate slowly, systematically, the way she did everything. When she was done, she put her spoon in the bowl and folded her hands on the table. "Mommy said I couldn't go," she said, "because of my grades." "What grades?" I said. "She said I needed to bring up my reading score before I could go on a big trip. She said Caleb and Sophie worked hard and they earned it." I didn't say anything for a moment. I looked at my granddaughter's hands folded on the table. I thought about the reading score comment and what I knew about Maya, who had been reading above her grade level since 3rd grade, who had devoured the entire Narnia series over Christmas break, who carried a library book to the breakfast table on a Saturday morning while her family was on a plane to Rome. "What is your reading score?" I asked. She looked at the table. "I don't know exactly. Mrs. Patterson said I was doing well. But Mommy said she had different information." I reached over and I put my hand over her folded hands and I held them for a moment. She was 9 years old and she was not crying, which was almost worse than if she had been, because it meant she had made some calculus about what was worth crying over and had decided this wasn't on the list. "Grandpa Lou," she said, "is it because I'm adopted?" There are questions that take the floor out from under you. Not because they're unexpected necessarily, but because a child shouldn't have to be the one asking them.
A child should have a life so full of evidence to the contrary that the question doesn't need to occur to her. And the fact that Maya was sitting here asking me, calmly, with her rabbit propped against the sugar bowl, meant that the evidence in her life had been insufficient. It had been insufficient for long enough that she had been forced to develop her own hypothesis. I told her no. I told her she was absolutely loved and absolutely wanted. I told her the truth as I understood it at that moment, which was incomplete, which was a story without its whole shape yet. And then I told her I was going to make her some scrambled eggs, and we were going to go to the park, and that I would figure the rest of it out. She nodded. She picked up Biscuit. She said, "Can we go to the one with the climbing wall?" "Yeah," I said. "We can go to the one with the climbing wall." She went to get dressed.
I stood at the kitchen counter and I looked out the window at the backyard I had helped Patrick build the deck on 5 summers ago. The one with the planters along the railing that Renee had filled with tomatoes every summer since. And I felt something settle into place inside me that I had been trying to avoid feeling for 2 years. I am not an impulsive man. I never have been. 31 years of engineering teaches you that the worst decisions are made in reaction to the worst moments. A structure fails and someone wants to point at something immediately, wants to condemn something immediately. And what you have to do is slow down and look at the whole system. Look at every load. Understand what was carrying what and for how long, and what finally gave. Reaction without analysis is just damage stacked on top of damage. So I made the eggs. I drove her to the park with the climbing wall.
I pushed her on the swings for 20 minutes, even though 9-year-olds are generally past the age of wanting to be pushed on swings. And Maya was not past it. Or maybe she was, and was choosing to allow herself not to be. And either way, I pushed her, and she laughed. The kind of laugh that starts quiet and then gets away from her. And while I did all of that, in the part of my brain that never fully stops running calculations, I began to build the analysis. There is a method I used for 31 years when a project came to me with anomalies that didn't initially make sense. Numbers that were off by amounts too consistent to be error. Patterns in the data that suggested something deliberate rather than accidental. You didn't start with conclusions. You started with questions. You collected what you could verify. You established what was true before you started constructing meaning.
After the park, I took Maya to my house, which she had always called the quiet house, meaning it in the best possible way. I set her up in the spare room with Biscuit and her library book and a plate of apple slices and peanut butter, and I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook, the same brown spiral notebook I used for every project I ever ran. Not sentimental about it, just functional. And I wrote down what I knew. Maya was not on the trip to Italy. Her siblings were. The stated reason was her grades. The verifiable evidence contradicted the stated reason. Renee had not told me Maya would be home, which meant Renee either forgot or assumed someone else would be around, or did not want me to know. I did not know which yet. Each of those possibilities had a different shape. I called my neighbor Dorothy, who watches these things, and asked her how long Renee's car had been gone. Dorothy said since early Friday morning, which matched a 6 a.m. departure.
She asked if everything was all right. I said yes, and that I'd explain later. I called Renee's mother-in-law, June, on the pretext of confirming something about a birthday gathering we had tentatively discussed. June, who is a cheerful woman with a gift for saying more than she realizes, mentioned offhandedly that Patrick had been looking forward to this trip for months, a real refresh for the family. Just the 5 of them, and then corrected herself, said she meant the 4 of them, and laughed a little uncomfortably and changed the subject. Just the 5 of them. I wrote that down. I underlined it. Not because June was a reliable witness to Renee's intentions, but because it told me something about how the trip had been discussed. If June had said the 5 of them as the natural number and then corrected to 4, It meant the framing she had heard was a family unit that included Maya, and the reality had been different enough that she'd had to adjust. It told me this was not impulsive. It had been planned. And it had been planned quietly. I spent the rest of that afternoon with Maya, who helped me rake leaves in the backyard because she liked raking leaves even in April, when there weren't really any. She just liked the rake. We had dinner, pasta with butter the way she liked it, and I let her stay up past her bedtime to watch a nature documentary about octopuses, which she declared the best animals, and I did not argue. I put her to bed at 9:30, and I sat in the kitchen with my cold coffee, and I looked at my notebook, and I thought about the word deliberate. There is a structural term in engineering, not poetic, nothing I'd use in ordinary conversation, just a term, called differential settlement. It refers to what happens when two parts of a foundation sink at different rates. Usually gradual, usually invisible on the surface for a long time. But underneath, the pressure builds.
And what appears to be a stable structure is not. The crack, when it comes, looks sudden. It is never sudden. Renee had been differentially settling this family for years. I had watched it and named it as adjustment, as transition, as the natural difficulty of blending children from different origins. I had been wrong. Differential settlement doesn't fix itself. It requires intervention. And the longer you wait, the more you have to take apart to address it correctly. I was not going to wait any longer. If you're new here and you've been listening this far, I want to ask you something, and it costs you nothing. Hit the like button while you're listening. Leave a comment below and tell me, what would you have done? Would you have waited for Renee to come home and said nothing? Or would you have called? Subscribe if you want to know how this ends, because I promise you, it doesn't end the way you're thinking. A lot of people thought they knew where this was going. They didn't. And now, back to it. I called my oldest friend, a man named Gerald Okonkwo, the following morning while Maya was still asleep. Gerald is a retired family law attorney who spent 34 years in the courts of the state. And he is the kind of man who says very few words and means every one of them. We have been friends since we were 23 and new to our respective careers, meeting in a morning coffee shop where we were both regulars, and where we discovered that we both read the same newspaper section first, and both took our coffee the same way, and both had zero interest in talking to anyone before 10 o'clock. These are the foundations of lasting friendship. I told him what I knew. He listened without interrupting, which is his natural state. When I finished, there was a pause of perhaps 15 seconds. "Lou," he said, "what is it you're trying to determine? Whether this is a legal problem or a family problem?" "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "I'm trying to determine what it is before I decide what to do about it." "Those are two different conversations," he said. "I can tell you about the first one. The second one is yours." "Tell me about the first one." He did. An adopted child has the same legal standing as a biological child in terms of parental obligations, including provision and non-discrimination in treatment. Excluding an adopted child from family activities while including biological children is not by itself actionable in law. Families make differential decisions about children for all kinds of reasons, some of them legitimate, some of them not. But as a pattern, documented, in combination with other factors, it could become relevant if it rose to the level of emotional neglect or discriminatory treatment. He said this carefully, without editorializing. He said he was not suggesting this situation had risen to that level. He said he was providing information. "What would you do?" I asked.
"If it were your granddaughter." Another pause. Gerald does not answer questions like that quickly. "I would make sure she knew, unambiguously, that she was loved," he said. "I would make sure she had a person in her corner who was not going anywhere. And I would have an honest conversation with Renee that didn't leave room for ambiguity." "What if the honest conversation doesn't work?" "Then you have the conversation a different way," he said. But Lou, before any of that, make sure you're right about what you think you're seeing. Because you're an engineer. You know the difference between a crack in the surface and a crack in the load-bearing wall. Don't tear down a wall if it's the surface that needs attention. I thanked him, and I sat with that for a long time. He was right. I needed to be methodical. I needed to gather more than I had. I needed to understand the full load distribution before I touched anything.
Maya came downstairs in her pajamas at 8:15 with Biscuit tucked under one arm. She asked if we could have waffles. I said yes. She stood on the step stool she'd used at my kitchen counter since she was 6. I'd never put it away, and she'd never asked me to. And she handed me ingredients with the seriousness of someone assisting in a real operation. While the waffle iron heated, she said, without looking up from the measuring cup, "Grandpa Lou, am I staying here until they come back?" "Yes," I said. "You're staying with me." She poured the batter. "Okay," she said. And that was all. That "okay" was one of the heaviest words I have ever heard a child say. Renee called me on day 3. I had been wondering when she would, and I had been wondering whether the call would be to check on Maya or to ask about the plants. It was to ask about the plants. "Oh, and Maya is doing okay?" she added, at the end, in the tone of someone checking a box. "She's fine," I said. "She's here with me."
A pause. "Oh, I thought Mrs. Delacroix next door was going to look in on her." "Mrs. Delacroix is 79, I said, and had a hip replacement in February." "Right," Renee said. There was something careful in her voice. "Well, I'm glad you're there, Dad." I had about 30 things I wanted to say in that moment. I said none of them. I asked about the trip, and she told me about the Colosseum, and Patrick had found a restaurant in Trastevere, and Caleb had eaten an entire plate of cacio e pepe by himself, and Sophie had bought a charm for her bracelet. She told me these things with a lightness that I recognized. It was the lightness of someone who had made a difficult decision and needed to believe the difficulty was behind her. "Renee," I said, when there was a natural pause, "I'd like to have dinner with you and Patrick the first night you're home. Just the adults." She said she thought that sounded nice. She said she'd missed me. I said I'd see her soon. I hung up and sat with my notebook. I added to my notes. What I had now was a pattern, not a single incident. That was what Gerald had told me to establish. Not a crack in the surface, but a crack in something load-bearing. I did not have everything I needed yet, but I had enough to know what kind of conversation I needed to have, and what it needed to accomplish. I thought about what Gerald had said. Make sure she knew, unambiguously, that she was loved. I had been doing that. I would keep doing it. But the other part, the conversation that left no room for ambiguity, that needed to be prepared. Carefully, with documentation, with specificity, with the same methodology I used when I had to present findings on a bridge inspection to a board that didn't want to hear what I was going to tell them. You don't arrive at that meeting with feelings. You arrive with data. You arrive with photographs.
You arrive with the load calculations and the historical record and the comparison against the specifications. You let the numbers make the argument. And then you speak plainly. I spent the next 3 days preparing. Maya and I settled into a routine that had the comfortable solidity of something much older than a week. Mornings, she helped me in the kitchen, and then read in the sunroom where my late wife Margaret used to do her crossword puzzles, in the chair by the window that gets the eastern light. I watched her in that chair sometimes and thought about Margaret, who would have loved this child beyond all accounting. Afternoons we went somewhere. The library on Tuesday, the Science Museum on Wednesday, a long walk along the creek path on Thursday, where Maya collected 3 interesting rocks and named them Gerald, Biscuit Jr., and Patricia. She did not mention Italy again. She did not ask when her family was coming home, in a way that suggested urgency. She adapted, the way she always adapted, with a thoroughness that should have been a comfort, and instead quietly broke my heart. Because children who adapt this completely have usually had to practice. On Friday evening I drove her home. Renee and Patrick were back.
The house lit up, the smell of takeout through the door. Caleb's duffel bag spilling lacrosse equipment in the hallway. Sophie flung herself at Maya with the energy of a child who had genuinely missed her sister. And Maya went stiff for half a second in the way she did when physical affection arrived unexpectedly. And then she returned the hug. Caleb said, "Maya, look what I got you," and produced a small ceramic figure of a gladiator. And Maya looked at it for a long moment and said, "He has a dent in his helmet," with a solemnity that made Caleb laugh. Renee hugged me. She smelled like the particular combination of airplane and European hotel that I remembered from a trip Margaret and I took to Portugal in 2003. She said, "Dad, thank you so much." Patrick shook my hand. He is a man I have never had a simple feeling about. There is nothing wrong with him that I can point to directly. He provides for his family. He is not cruel. He is not absent. But there is something in him that I have always read as a man who married a version of his life, rather than a life itself. He makes decisions about his family the way he makes decisions about his house, efficiently, with an eye for the result, less attentive to the process. He is not a bad father. He is an inattentive one, in the particular way of men who have never been asked to pay close attention. "Thanks for stepping in, Lou," he said. "The neighbor situation wasn't as sordid as we thought." "No," I said. "It wasn't." I hugged Maya and told her I would call her tomorrow. She nodded. She was already watching Renee with those dark, patient eyes, reading the room the way she always read rooms. I said I'd see Renee and Patrick Saturday for dinner, and I drove home in the truck, and I did not turn on the radio. The restaurant was Patrick's suggestion, a place downtown that he liked for business dinners, which told me something about how he was framing the occasion. I arrived first and sat at the table they had reserved, and ordered water, and did not look at my phone. I had my notebook with me. Not to show them. I knew better than to open a folder on someone you're confronting directly, because the gesture shuts down the conversation before it starts. But I had prepared from it, and everything I needed was now in my head, ordered and sequenced the way I had ordered and sequenced thousands of structural analyses over 31 years. They arrived together, Patrick with his hand at the small of Renee's back, both of them smiling the particular smile of people who are slightly uncertain about what kind of dinner this was going to be. Renee kissed my cheek.
Patrick ordered a bottle of wine before they sat down, which he always did, a habit I had noted without judgment for years. We talked for a while about the trip. I asked questions and listened and let them settle. This is the principle Gerald had articulated and that I had practiced for 3 decades in every difficult meeting I had ever run. You let people arrive somewhere comfortable before you take the floor away. It is not manipulation, it is courtesy. It gives people the best possible chance to respond well to what is coming, and it removes the excuse that they were ambushed. When the appetizers came, Renee said, "So, Dad, what did you want to talk about?" I put down my fork. I looked at her. "I want to talk about Maya," I said. Something moved across Renee's face. Not guilt exactly, or not only guilt. More like the face of someone who had known this conversation was coming and had been preparing for it. She picked up her wine glass. Patrick looked at me with the measured expression of a man who was deciding what posture to take. "What about Maya?" Renee said. "She asked me," I said, carefully, "if the reason she wasn't on the trip was because she's adopted." Renee's jaw tightened. "She shouldn't have said that." "She's 9, I said. 9-year-olds say what they're trying to make sense of. "Her grades." "Renee." I said it quietly, not loudly. The way you say a name when you want someone to hear the weight behind it. I know Maya's teachers. I've been to school events. Her reading scores are excellent. Mrs. Patterson confirmed this to me in an email this week, which I asked for, which I have. A silence. Patrick set down his wine glass. "Dad," Renee said, "you don't understand the whole picture." "Then help me understand it," I said. "Because the picture I have
is a child who was left behind while her family went to Europe, who was told this was because of her grades, which are not insufficient, who was placed in a care arrangement that was not functional, and who is now asking whether the explanation for all of this is her adoption status. That is the picture I have. If there is a fuller picture, I genuinely want to see it. What followed was a conversation I had prepared for, and that still, in moments, surprised me. Not because Renee said things that were cruel, because she didn't. She said things that were human and complicated and painful in the particular way of things that have been true for a while without being spoken. She said that the trip had been planned as a specific experience for the older kids, something to do with Caleb's age and a particular milestone. She said that Maya had been having a hard adjustment period that made her difficult to travel with. Tantrums, anxiety in unfamiliar situations, what Renee described as too much for an international trip right now. She said she had consulted their family therapist, which I would verify later, and which turned out to be a selective truth. She had mentioned the trip in a session, but had not asked for a direct recommendation. She said she loved Maya. She said this several times, in the way of someone who needed it to be believed. I don't question that you love her, I said, but love is a foundation. It's not the whole structure. And the structure that Maya is living in is telling her something different than what you're telling me right now. Patrick cleared his throat. Lou, with respect, this is our family. You're her grandfather. This isn't... Patrick. I looked at him steadily. I spent 31 years making sure structures could carry the weight that was put on them. That is my entire professional framework. And it is also the only way I know how to think. What I am telling you is that this child is carrying weight she was not designed to carry alone. I am not here to threaten anything. I am here to tell you what I see, and to ask you to take it seriously. He looked at me for a long moment. He is not a stupid man. He knew that I was not simply a concerned grandfather making a fuss. He knew there was something beneath this dinner, some structure of preparation that he couldn't fully see. What exactly are you asking? Renee said. Her voice had dropped. The defensive register had shifted into something quieter. I'm asking you to see her, I said. Not to manage her, not to include her on a checklist, to actually see her. To understand that every time you make a decision that divides your children into different categories, even for reasons that feel rational to you, she registers it. She catalogs it.
She is building a case, the way children build cases, about who she is and where she stands. And right now, the case she is building is one that I am not willing to let stand without saying something. Renee put her hand over her eyes. Not crying yet, just blocking something out for a moment. I didn't mean for it to be like that, she said finally. Her voice was thick. I know, I said. I know you didn't. That's not the question. Here is something I want to be clear about, because it matters to how you understand what came next. I do not believe Renee is a bad mother. I don't believe she sat down one day and decided that her biological children would be first-class passengers and her adopted daughter would be something else. I believe she made a decision about a trip that felt justified in the moment, and I believe she had been making 100 smaller decisions like it for 2 years without quite seeing what they were adding up to. I believe she loved Maya in a way that was real, but that had never fully reckoned with the specific, particular, irreducible weight of adopting a child who came from a world of loss and needed not just love, but visible, unmistakable, repeated, unqualified inclusion. There is a difference between a bad person and a person who has done something wrong. This is not a moral escape hatch. The thing still needs to be addressed, but it changes what addressing it looks like, and it changes what you're hoping to accomplish. I was not trying to condemn Renee. I was trying to redirect the structure before it failed in a way that couldn't be repaired. After dinner, in the parking lot, Renee hugged me for a long time. She didn't say anything for a while, and I didn't push her.
Patrick stood off to the side with his hands in his pockets, looking at the parking lot, processing in the way of a man who processes things privately. "I'm going to call Dr. Fenway," Renee said, their family therapist.
"Good," I said. "And Dad, I want you to know that I know you did this because you love her." "I did it because she asked me a question that a 9-year-old should never have to ask," I said. "And because she folded her hands on the table and waited for the answer with more patience than most adults would have." Renee made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. She squeezed my arm. She and Patrick got in their car. I drove home in the truck. The pine tree swayed a little from the rearview mirror. The night was cool, the kind of late April cool that still has winter in it. I thought about load distribution, about the principle that a well-designed structure distributes weight across all its members so that no single point bears more than it can carry, about how the most important thing a foundation can do is be consistent, not dramatic, not visually impressive, just dependable, day after day, regardless of weather. Maya needed a foundation. She had one in me. I intended to keep it that way. 3 weeks after the dinner, Renee called me on a Sunday evening. She had been to 4 sessions with Dr. Fenway, the last 2 with Patrick, and 1 session that she asked me to attend, which I did, sitting in a chair across from a calm, direct woman who had clearly heard difficult family stories before and who listened to all of us with equal attention. Renee cried in that session in a way that was not managed or composed. It was the kind of crying that surprises the person doing it. The summer after, they took a family trip to the North Carolina coast, all 4 of them. Maya collected 17 shells and refused to leave any of them behind, and they had to buy an extra bag for the drive home. I know this because she called me from the beach to tell me about each one. 17 descriptions of shells, delivered with the particular solemnity of a child reporting something important. I sat in my kitchen and took notes in the brown spiral notebook. Not because I needed to remember them, but because I wanted her to know I was writing them down. The pine tree in my truck still hangs from the rearview mirror. The scent has been gone for years, but I know exactly what it smells like, because I remember. Maya is 10 now. She has her own key to my house. Same copy I had made for Margaret years ago. Same hardware store key tag with a little yellow sun on it. She comes over on Saturday mornings sometimes. Still uses the step stool at the kitchen counter. Still brings Biscuit, who is significantly more worn than he used to be, but is still in one piece. Last Saturday, she stood at my counter and helped me make waffles, and she said, without prelude, in the practical tone of someone resolving a question she'd been carrying, "Grandpa Lou, I know why you had dinner with Mom and Patrick." "Yeah?" I said. "Sophie told me some of it, and I figured out the rest." She poured the batter with careful attention. "You told them they weren't doing it right."
"I told them they could do it better," I said. She considered this.
"Is there a difference?"
"Yes," I said. "One closes a door, the other leaves it open." She nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was filing something. The waffle iron clicked, and I lifted the lid.
"Okay,"
she said.
And then, after a moment, "Grandpa Lou, I want you to know that I know you came on Saturday because you love me."
She said it exactly the way Renee had said it to me in the parking lot 3 weeks after the dinner. Same cadence, same weight. I looked at her, and she was looking at the waffle iron, not at me, which was her way of saying something serious without requiring a witness. "I did," I said. She nodded again. She handed me the plate. I put the waffle on it. Some structures you build to last, and some structures you maintain year after year, with nothing more dramatic than showing up and doing the same reliable thing, and trusting that the load will be held. That's all engineering is, in the end. The glamour is in the blueprints. The work is in the foundation. I was never a glamorous man. I was always a foundation man. I know what I'm for, and Maya knows where to find me.